just 50 years, South Korea's economy was no different from that of poor African countries. What was going on with the Korean economy for the past 50 years? Time to look back over the history of Korea's economic rise. 15th August 1948. The government of the Republic of Korea was established. After the Second World War, the majority of newly independent states are communist states, or states that choose economic models where the state is dominant. Because South Korea chose the free market system, it was able to enjoy the benefits of easy access to advanced Western civilization and technology. The choice of free markets also encouraged a spirit of self-help. Koreans worked hard for themselves and their families' living. But it all began with South Korea being so poor that it could not be self-sufficient. In the 1945 to 61 period, the United States provided a colossal $3.1 billion of aid, which was used to rebuild facilities destroyed in war and reconstruct the economy. However, South Korea could not rely on aid forever. In order to create the basis for self-sufficiency, the government of Seungman Rhee formulated a 3-year economic plan, while the Jangmyeon government formulated their own 5-year plan. Both were to go unimplemented.
우리의 적은 빈곤과 부정부패와 공산주의입니다. 나는 이것을 우리의 3대 공적으로 생각합니다.
The new military government that had seized power in a coup d'etat rushed to draw up an economic plan. January 1962, first 5-year plan unveiled. Annual growth target of 7.1%. However, given the 2.3% annual growth rates of the previous 3 years, such plans appeared rather overly ambitious. It would be necessary to provide large amounts of investment capital in order to achieve such ambitious growth targets. But neither domestic nor foreign capital were available in suitable amounts. Korea should find a new way. The government reduced the scale of their ambitions and released a revised first 5-year plan in February 1964, with the growth target cut from 7% to 5%. However, a new way had already begun to open. From 1962, exports of industrial goods, principally tinned iron, plywood, and apparel, began to rise. The business world had taken the lead, moving to increase exports ahead of the government. The government also became interested in exports. In May 1964, a new economic team under Jang Gi-young, Deputy Prime Minister, was assembled. The team pushed for an export-first economic policy. Finally, in late 1964, the country achieved exports of $100 million. January 1965, the President Park, in his annual address, sets 3 national priorities: increase production, exports, and construction. From then on, the government mobilized all its energies to promote exports. From February 1965, the enlarged Conference for Export Promotion under the President's direct oversight met monthly. Park Chung-hee, from the first meeting until his death in 1979, attended nearly every meeting. Export-led industrialization was strategy without precedent in the industrialization of other undeveloped countries. Up until then, the developmental economics underdeveloped states were urged to substitute domestically produced goods for imports. It was a new idea for a developing country to export while industrializing. Later on, economists called Korea's strategy export-led industrialization, or export-oriented industrialization. The rapid rise in South Korean exports of industrial goods was the result of riding the waves of rapid global economic growth. Until the first oil shock of 1973, the global economy grew at unprecedented speed, an annual rate of 4.9%. As incomes and wages grew in developed countries, it became difficult to maintain labor-intensive light industries like apparel, toy production, wigs, and domestic appliances. Developing nations nurtured these light industry, seizing the opportunity to export industrial goods to the developed world. South Korea, a country where the majority had received an education, was just such a country. Exports rose rapidly every year at a staggering rate of 40% on average. In the 1970s, textiles, plywood, and wigs, processed light industrial goods, were the principal export items. At first, it was the unprocessed textiles and apparel that were exported, but soon finished clothes became the major export. In 1970, apparel formed 40% of total exports, a major export product. Plywood, another founding member of the export club. The lumber industry learned from Japanese plywood makers and energized the industry. The production of wigs utilized the abundant supply of skilled female labor, as well as all the hair to be found domestically. It was exactly the right kind of industry for South Korea in the 1960s. In 1970, the top three exports were apparel, followed by plywood and wigs. Thus, to start with, South Korean exports were not all that impressive. But beginning with simple light industrial goods and gradually moving up the value chain proved to be the right way to industrialize. In the late 1960s, with the mobilization of South Korean soldiers to fight in Vietnam, South Korean companies entered the freight and construction markets there. From 1965 to 73, the provision of military supplies, construction services, as well as the remittances of technicians and soldiers proved to be a huge opportunity to earn foreign currency. The smooth export of light industrial produce was possible thanks to cheap and abundant labor. In the mid-1960s, Korean workers were paid only half of workers in the Philippines, Thailand, and Taiwan. But they worked the longest hours. Low labor costs were the weapon that enabled Korean light industrial products to rapidly gain market share. But poor labor conditions were to become a big social issue. On 13 November 1970, a 22-year-old garment cutter named Jun Tae-il, who worked at the Peace Market in Dongdaemun, set himself on fire and demanded that the labor laws be respected. However, with industrialization, wages were rapidly rising. The textiles factories of the 1960s and 1970s were the first steps out of poverty. From here on, Korea's ascent out of poverty became more rapid. The expansion of light industry products brought development in other related industries. Chemical fiber industry was typical in this regard. From the late 1950s, stretch processing import companies processed nylon to make socks and other textiles, becoming popular. Seeing an opportunity, a businessman built a nylon factory. Soon, acrylic and polyester factories were also built. These companies were given loan guarantees by banks and government for foreign loans and domestic capital. Such as it was. Later, these companies developed into large industrial conglomerates, chaebol. The success of Korean labor-intensive industries can be seen in the manual assembly of parts in electronic industry. At first, the Korean electronic industry assembled foreign-produced electronic parts. As private companies like Gold Star began to produce electronics domestically, the government moved to give its active support in the creation of new industry. U.S. and Japanese electronic companies seeking to take advantage of cheap, quality Korean labor flooded in, setting up companies and creating joint ventures to produce parts. In 1969, the large conglomerate Samsung began to produce TVs and vacuum tubes exclusively for export. In the early stages, production centered on parts like condensers and transistors. Later, production transitioned to finished goods like black and white TVs and video recording equipment. From the 1970s onward, exports increased dramatically. The major driving force behind export growth at this point was the heavy chemical industrialization policy set out by the government. From the 1970s, heavy industrial exports increased. Electronics, steel products, and ships were the number 2 and number 3 exports. In the later half of the 1980s, automobiles became the 3rd largest export. In the 1990s, electronics became the number 1 export. Chemical engineering goods and other general equipment newly became the principal export. In a short time, South Korea has quickly progressed up the export value chain with higher value-added products. With the first oil shock in late 1973, the price of importing oil increased rapidly. As the balance of trade deteriorated, the government sought to alleviate the problem by entering the Middle Eastern construction market. Following the example set by Samhuan, a number of companies entered the market, winning contracts in road and port construction. Hyundai Construction Company secured a contract to build the Saudi Jubal Seaport, a project costing $940 million. This was the largest construction project in the world at the time. It took 3 years, 6 months to complete. The total value of contracts won by Korean companies continued to rise, and in 1982, South Korea was second to the United States in world construction market. The hard work and sweat of Korean workers and businessmen in the hot, sandy winds of the Arabian Desert became a powerful motive force in the rise of the Korean economy in the 1970s. With the beginning of economic development in the early 1960s, both exports and imports rose. However, the South Korean economy finally achieved external balance. The ratio of exports to imports rose from the early 1960s as economic development sped up. The three lows of the 1980s confirmed the self-sufficiency of the Korean economy. As the global economy began to experience low dollar exchange rates, low interest rates, and low oil prices, the export of Korean heavy and chemical industrial products rose rapidly. Thus began what became known as the boom of the three lows. From the late 1980s, the country became economically self-relying. The Republic of Korea had nothing to offer but people. If it had had natural resources, there would have been no need to export plywood, textiles, and wigs. In the early stages, the country developed expertise in producing simple processed goods. Later, it was able to make goods that required more skilled labor and sophisticated technology. The export-led industrialization strategy resulted in South Korea becoming part of the global economic system. Korean business, by continuing to improve the quality of their operations, can continue to modernize the Korean economy.